Good morning, students. Let's come to next topic, decolonization and independence. We have been looking into the post-Second World War economy, post-Second World War world. When the Second World War entered, large parts of the world were still under the European colonial rule. Over the next 2 decades, most colonies in Asia and Africa emerged as free independent nations. They were, however, overburdened by poverty and a lack of resources, and their economies and societies were handicapped by long periods of colonial rule. Several centuries in India's case, more than 200 years, India was under the British rule or foreign rule, and it handicapped India's economy. It crippled India's economy. And the IMF and the World Bank were designed to meet the financial needs of the industrial countries, not the developing countries. They were not equipped to cope with the challenges of poverty and lack of development in the former colonies. But as Europe and Japan rapidly rebuilt their economies, they grew less dependent on the IMF and the World Bank. Thus, from the late 1950s, the Bretton Woods institutions began to shift their attention more towards developing countries. So actually the World Bank and IMF were not supposed to or designed to support the developing countries, but once the European countries and Japan, they developed very fast and they were not that dependent on these institutions. From 1950 onwards, these institutions, financial institutions, started supporting or looking towards the developing countries. As colonies, many of the less developed regions of the world had been part of Western empires. Now, ironically, as newly independent countries facing urgent pressure to lift their populations out of poverty, they came under the guidance of international agencies dominated by the former colonial powers. Even after many years of decolonization, the former colonial powers still control vital resources such as minerals and land in many of their former colonies. Of course, the third world countries, the developing countries or underdeveloped countries, they got freedom from their colonial rulers, but still these colonial powers or the Western powers have dominance or control over the resources of many of these underdeveloped countries. See, large corporations of other powerful countries, for example the US, also often manage to secure rights to exploit developing countries' natural resources very cheaply. This was the developing countries. They were not able to exploit maximum or utilize their resources. So this situation, exploited by the developed countries, industrial countries like the US. At the same time, most developing countries did not benefit from the fast growth the Western economies experienced in the 1950s and 60s. Therefore, they organized themselves as a group, the group of 77, G77. Means 77 countries grew. These were the third world countries or the developing countries, and they had this group and they stood for their rights. to demand a new international economic order. By the NIEO, they meant a system that would give them real control over their natural resources, more development assistance, fairer prices for raw materials, and better access for their manufactured goods in developed countries' market. These were the demands of these G77 or their group NIEO. So they were asking for, it was not, they didn't have that much access into the developed countries' economies or markets. That was not possible for the developing countries, and they were still selling agricultural products and raw materials. So that was an issue with these countries. Okay, let's come to the last topic of this chapter, that is end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of globalization. This chapter we started with the globalization, and we saw the pre-modern world and world economy. Then we saw the 19th century world and economy. Then we came to the economy post or the time of First World War and the Great Depression. Then the next title, that was the Second World War, post Second World War economy, and there how the world economy is developed, and that we have been looking into now. And last, after the Second World War or the post Second World War, the Bretton Woods system or the Bretton Woods institutions that emerged, and now those institutions are declining their importance and coming the emergence of globalization. Okay, now we'll come to that. See, despite years of stable and rapid growth, not all was well in this post-war world. From the 1960s, the rising cost of its overseas involvement weakened the U.S. finances and competitive strength. The U.S. dollar now no longer commanded confidence as the world's principal currency. It could not maintain its value in relation to gold. This eventually led to the collapse of the system of fixed exchange rates and the introduction of a system of floating exchange rates. Okay, so it was after Second World War, we saw that US became the world power, and they played world police, and they were involving everywhere in the world, and because of that, or sending their forces everywhere into every countries in every continent. So the expense of these kinds of involvement was too much, so it affected their economy as well. Now, so there was a fixed exchange rate, that means the currency rate related to, see, dollar was the world currency, and it was other currencies, for example our rupees, and there was a fixed rate of exchange. Now that's gone. Why? Because of the fluctuation or the rate fluctuation of dollar. Now they had to follow floating exchange rates. That means the rate or value of the dollar can be fluctuated, change. It can go higher or lower. Okay. Now, from the mid 1970s, the international financial system also changed in important ways. Earlier, developing countries could turn to international institutions for loans and development assistance. Okay, but now they were forced to borrow from Western commercial banks and private lending institutions. This led to periodic debt crisis in the developing world and lower incomes and increased poverty, especially in Africa and Latin America. We have seen that the Bretton Woods institutions were declining, and now what happened? The developed countries, the Western countries, they were having institutions, their own private banks and bankers, as in the US after the First World War time. So the private bankers and institutions, from them the developing countries were getting assistance or taking loans, and this indebted these countries, especially African and Latin American countries. Okay, the industrial world was also hit by unemployment that began rising from the mid 70s and remained high until the early 90s. Now unemployment that was not that much in the developed countries, now developed countries also are facing unemployment during this period, during 70s and 90s. Okay, then from the late 70s, MNCs, multinational corporations, started to shift production operation to low-wage Asian countries. These countries were established in the Western countries, America and the developed countries. Now these MNCs, they started investing or establishing their companies in low-wage Asian countries, mainly China. China had been cut off from the post-war world economy since its revolution in 49, but new economic policies in China and the collapse of the Soviet Union and Soviet-style communism in Eastern Europe brought many countries back into the fold of the world economy. Now we have seen earlier that the declining of Bretton Woods institutions and the decreasing prominence of United States, and one more thing, the two superpowers after Second World War, the US and the Soviet Union. Now Soviet Union also collapsed, and now new economies came into the fold of world economy, and China also was emerging as a country of investment. Okay, why? Wages were relatively low in countries like China, thus they became attractive destinations for investment by foreign MNCs competing to capture world markets. Okay, so there was a competition between the MNCs, so they were trying to minimize their cost, their expenses. So countries like China, their wage was so low that they could save a lot of money as the labor charge. You might have seen many materials, the products coming, all these you may see the sticker, or it is written there that it is made in China. Means many items are produced in China. That is because of the low wages in China. Okay, so the relocation of industry to low-wage countries stimulated world trade and capital flows. In the last 2 decades, the world's economic geography has been transformed as countries such as India, China and Brazil have undergone rapid economic transformation. So this is the real globalization that we see today, that the investment from the developed countries like the US and the European countries, it transformed or shifted to the Asian countries or the countries where the wage is low or the expenditure is very low.